The winter of 1863 slammed into Hollow Creek like a freight train of ice and silence, smothering the Utah settlement beneath a suffocating blanket of snow. For months, the mountain pass that led in and out was swallowed by white, no food, no letters, no escape. It was as if the entire town had been erased from the map. And at the center of it all, high on the hill like a king over a frozen kingdom, stood Obadiah Lafferty, a man once hailed as a saint, now feared as something much, much worse. He watched from his frostbitten window, his eyes sharp and storm-colored, as the snow buried the world around him. His body, once powerful, had withered down to bone and spirit, not from sickness, but from choice. Years of fasting. Years of what he called purification. Years of trying to get closer to the divine, or whatever voice had started whispering in the silence. 15 years earlier, Obadiah had stepped into Utah territory as a hero. Respected. Rich. Righteous. A man of charity and trade. His wife was the daughter of a powerful church elder. His reputation. Untouchable. But somewhere in the white void of Hollow Creek, something changed. It didn't happen all at once. The transformation was slow, terrifyingly slow. He began hearing things, seeing visions, claiming angels were speaking to him. At first, people thought it was passion. Then prophecy. Then, finally, madness. His compound grew larger. His sermons, darker. His voice echoed with fire and judgment. He let his beard grow wild, his body turn gaunt, his words become riddles. He no longer preached to God, he claimed to speak for him. The townspeople whispered in fear. The silence of the winter wasn't peace, it was pressure, building like a storm behind the eyes of a man who thought he had pierced the veil of mortality. And then, one night, he said it again. The angel spoke to me. But this time, he didn't say what the angel told him. Not yet. And when he did, everything in Hollow Creek would change. Forever. Obadiah murmured the words like a secret spell, barely audible over the moan of the winter wind outside. His eldest son, Ezekiel, stood frozen by the door, gripping a leather-bound journal so tightly his knuckles had turned white. That journal held everything, every wild prophecy, every dark command, and with each new word his father uttered, the book seemed to grow heavier in his trembling hands. What did he say, Father? Ezekiel asked, his voice cracking like thin ice. He already knew he wouldn't like the answer. At just 23, Ezekiel had inherited his father's angular frame but none of his fire. Fear had aged him young, lines etched deep across his brow, shoulders permanently slouched as if ducking an invisible blow. His hair hung limp, his skin pale, his clothes stained with the slow decay of a life lived entirely under his father's shadow. He looked like someone who had stopped trying, because hope no longer made sense. Obadiah turned toward him with chilling slowness. Every movement deliberate. Every gesture sharp. His eyes locked on his son like a hawk studying a trembling mouse. And then he said it, voice low, steady, intoxicating. He revealed the final sacrament, my son, the one that will complete our purification and secure our place in the celestial kingdom. Ezekiel's heart dropped. That tone, that cold, confident cadence, it was the same voice that had once drawn dozens of followers to Hollow Creek. It had inspired loyalty, devotion, even love. But now it carried something else. Not light. Not salvation. Hunger. Something darker than doctrine. Something ancient and starved. Outside, the compound stood silent beneath a blanket of snow, but within those walls, something twisted was taking shape. 3 buildings formed a triangle around a courtyard that no one dared cross alone after dark. It was no longer a home, it was a fortress. The main house, where Obadiah ruled with his 3 wives and 7 children, had been fortified like a stronghold. Every window was positioned with purpose. Nothing entered or exited unseen. The second house held his most loyal followers, 6 adults and their children who had abandoned the outside world, convinced this was a sacred place. They thought they'd found heaven. But the truth was, they were prisoners in a place where purity meant obedience, and obedience meant surrender. And then, there was the third building. The temple. Windowless. Cold. Designed, Obadiah claimed, from a vision sent directly from the throne of God. Inside, rituals were performed. Rituals that no outsider had ever witnessed. Not anymore. Not since they'd grown darker. Over the past 3 years, what had started as ceremonies of light had turned into something Ezekiel couldn't even name. Something secret. Something sealed behind heavy doors and holy words that now sounded more like warnings. Every morning began with pre-dawn prayers in the main house. Eyes closed. Knees on cold wood. Obadiah's voice the only sound, his words like chains wrapping tighter around everyone's minds. Then came breakfast, thin porridge, bread, milk from the compound's dwindling cattle. Food not for nourishment, but control. Then the day's work began, always directed, always watched. No one questioned. Not anymore. Because in Hollow Creek, obedience wasn't just expected. It was survival. And Ezekiel knew, whatever came next, whatever that final sacrament was, it would demand more than faith. It would demand blood. While the compound creaked awake under another brutal morning, the routine kicked in like clockwork, because in Obadiah's world, even the smallest moment was controlled. The men were already outside in the freezing cold, tending livestock, hauling firewood, fixing fences. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They didn't pause unless permitted. Work wasn't just labor, it was obedience. Inside, the women prepared breakfast under the iron rule of Martha, the first wife. Her authority in the kitchen and household was absolute, but it wasn't power. It was survival. Martha stepped from the kitchen carrying a tray of bread and porridge like it was a holy offering. Her every move was cautious, silent, rehearsed. Once, she had been radiant, witty, quick to laugh, beloved across the Mormon community. At just 38, she looked decades older. Her blonde hair, streaked with gray, was tied back so tightly it seemed to pull her expression into permanent discipline. Her dress was a shapeless curtain of brown fabric, thick and modest by force, not by choice. But the real transformation wasn't physical. It was internal. Over 15 years, Obadiah had chipped away at her soul, bit by bit, until nothing remained but obedience. The sparkle in her eyes was long gone. What was left was devotion carved from fear. Behind her, the other wives followed in ghost-like formation. Not a word. Not a glance. Just practiced, robotic movements. This wasn't a family. It was a regime. Rebecca, the second wife, was once a strong-willed widow. She'd come to the compound 5 years earlier, lured by Obadiah's holy charisma and the promise of purpose. Her husband had died in a mining collapse. Obadiah offered her sanctuary. It felt like divine intervention. It was anything but. Now, at 32, Rebecca had the haunted grace of a woman who had learned that the cost of stepping out of line was painful correction, not just physical, but spiritual. Obadiah called it cleansing. She called it nothing. She no longer called anything anything. And then there was Sarah. Barely 25. The youngest. The newest. Married to Obadiah at just 19, she had grown up within these very walls, the daughter of one of his earliest, most devout followers. Her entire life had been shaped by his voice, his laws, his lies. When he married her, it wasn't just permitted, it was celebrated as divine favor. But Sarah wasn't like the others. She was still learning the rules. Still trying to understand why obedience felt so much like disappearing. Her youth made her vulnerable, but it also made her dangerous. Because somewhere behind her wide eyes was a flicker of something the compound hadn't seen in years. Doubt. And in Hollow Creek, doubt could be fatal. The wives moved in silence. Breakfast was served. The prophet's words still ruled. But beneath the surface, something was cracking. Slowly. Quietly. Like ice shifting under pressure. And when it broke, no one would be ready. Sarah, barely a woman, moved with the same lifeless grace as the others, the final piece in Obadiah's perfect order. Raised in the compound. Conditioned since birth. Married to the prophet as if it were a reward. And yet, that wide-eyed compliance wasn't submission. Not entirely. It was what came after the will to fight had been slowly, brutally worn down. She wasn't alone. Obadiah's children, 7 in total, were the cost of his so-called divine mission on their faces, in their posture, in the way they breathed like they were afraid to inhale too loudly. At the top of the ladder stood Ezekiel, 23. The reluctant heir. He remembered the before times, when his father was just a man, not a self-proclaimed prophet. That memory was both his curse and his only armor. Because knowing what life could be made this nightmare infinitely worse. He saw the madness for what it was. He just couldn't stop it. But deep in the shadows of this crumbling kingdom, another force stirred. Her name was Miriam. 17. Sharp as a blade. Deadpan on the surface. But behind her dark eyes, something burned. A spark her father hadn't crushed. Not yet. She served breakfast with robotic precision, moved with rehearsed obedience, but inside, she was planning. Miriam had turned survival into a science. For over a year, she had been documenting everything, the rituals, the threats, the nights filled with screams behind the temple walls. She wrote it all in a cipher of her own creation, pulled from religious texts and ancient languages her father worshipped but never truly understood. It was brilliant. It was dangerous. And it was her only hope. 200 pages of pure truth. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her freezing room. Her heartbeat raced every time she touched it. Because if Obadiah ever found it, the final sacrament would come for her next. But Miriam had no plans of dying in Hollow Creek. Then there was Mary, 15, already lost in a fog of fear. She rarely spoke. And when she did, her voice was flat, empty. The last few years had stripped away everything that made her smile. Her father didn't just rule her life. He had erased it. And the twins, Joseph and Samuel, only 13. They were 10 when the ceremonies began. Old enough to remember. Too young to understand. They had been dragged into the fire blindfolded. Forced to witness things no child should ever see. Their innocence wasn't stolen, it was shattered. Now, they were husks. Quiet. Withdrawn. Haunted. Every corner of the compound whispered with dread. Every hallway echoed with silence. But below it all, something pulsed. Fear. Anger. Rebellion. Obadiah believed he had complete control. But in the walls of his own fortress, a secret war was beginning. David was 11. Ruth, just 9. And little Benjamin, only 7 years old. For now, they were untouched. For now. But Miriam knew the truth. For now wouldn't last. Every sign pointed to the inevitable. Her father's depravity was escalating, and fast. She had watched it unfold, step by step, for 3 horrifying years. And now the youngest were next in line. That's why Miriam didn't just want to escape. She had to. Because if she failed, they'd all be lost. Then, that night, everything changed. Obadiah rose from the head of the long, splintered table in the main hall. The fire crackled in the hearth. Shadows twisted across the walls, walls coated with hand-painted scripture and warped biblical scenes. A crucifixion with no savior. A family portrait that was not a family, but a hierarchy of submission. And then he said it. Tonight, we perform the ritual of sacred union. The angel has spoken. Everything before was just preparation. The room froze. No one moved. No one breathed. The words hit like a crack of thunder, because every single person at that table knew. This wasn't just another night of pain. This was something worse. The younger kids, Mary, Joseph, Samuel, exchanged terrified glances. They didn't understand the theology. But they understood fear. They had seen the way people looked after the rituals. And they had seen Miriam cry silently through her prayers. The ceremonies had started innocently. At first. Simple prayers. Fasting. Singing. Then came the corrections. Then the private gatherings in the temple. Then, something else. Rebecca, the second wife, sat rigidly beside the fire. Her voice shook as she whispered. What does this ritual require, Father? 5 years ago, she had stepped into the compound with nothing but grief and a prayer. Her husband had died in a mining collapse. Obadiah had offered her a home. A purpose. Now she sat in a home built on torment, waiting to be called into something unspeakable. The table was silent. The flames hissed. Miriam gripped her spoon with white knuckles. Under the table, her fingers brushed her pocket. The key was hidden there. Not to a door. To her diary. The map. The plan. The only truth. Because tonight, everything was shifting. And if she didn't act soon, there would be no one left to save. Rebecca had once believed this place was her salvation. A widow. Alone. No home. No future. Then came Obadiah, the so-called prophet. He promised her divine purpose, a family, a holy calling. But 5 years later, she knew the truth. It wasn't salvation. It was entrapment. Her spirit had been chipped away, one twisted sermon at a time. Her freedom replaced with rules. Her body, a possession. Now, as she sat at the long table, every word Obadiah spoke sliced deeper than the last. Complete surrender, he said with that eerie, controlled calm. The angel has revealed that the flesh must be sanctified, through sacred union. That phrase hit like a bolt of lightning. Sacred union. But he didn't mean a wedding. He meant obliteration of boundaries. No more family lines. No more taboos. Just obedience. Obadiah's voice was smooth, practiced, like a man who had rehearsed every syllable for months, maybe years, convincing himself it was holy when it was monstrous. And then, the room changed. The air felt thicker. The silence was so intense, it became a sound of its own. The temperature dropped, like the fire had gone cold. Martha, the first wife, reached for her cup of tea, and her hand shook violently. The ceramic clinked like a bell of dread. Sarah, just 25, went pale. Her skin turned waxy, like a living statue of shock. She had known only this life, and even she knew this was a step into madness. Miriam sat frozen. Outside, she was calm, the perfect mask. But inside, her mind was on fire. The children, Martha whispered, and then stopped herself. Even she knew, questioning Obadiah out loud was blasphemy. And blasphemy meant correction. And correction meant hours in the temple. The fire cracked in the hearth. But the warmth was gone. Every person at the table had just realized. They weren't living in a commune. They weren't following a prophet. They were prisoners. And the final ritual had begun. Miriam tightened her fists under the table. Her plan had to move, tonight. Because the next step in Obadiah's revelation wasn't just evil. It was the point of no return. His study was a shrine not to God, but to Obadiah himself. Walls once meant for books were now lined with crude paintings, visions he claimed were angelic, though their imagery twisted biblical symbols into monstrous forms. A lion with 7 eyes. A lamb bleeding from the mouth. A cross wrapped in serpents. Each canvas screamed of a mind spiraling deeper into delusion. The desk at the center of the room was littered with open journals, fragments of ancient texts, pages of frenzied handwriting that blurred the line between scripture and obsession. A cracked mirror hung above, and Obadiah often stood before it, speaking not to his reflection, but to the being he believed watched him through the glass. Today was no different. He murmured in tongues, rocking slightly as he wrote page after page in his Book of the New Order, scripture of his own making, filled with proclamations of purity through pain, salvation through surrender, and obedience beyond blood. Outside, the compound was silent, but alive with tension. The children moved through chores as if under a spell, scraping ice from paths, fetching water, feeding animals, but their eyes remained distant, every glance stolen toward the temple with growing fear. The wives cleaned the main house in silence, scrubbing already clean surfaces, their bodies moving out of muscle memory, their minds locked behind blank faces. Miriam, however, was not sleepwalking. Beneath her practiced calm, she moved with a purpose. In her room, hidden under a plank near her cot, the diary waited. She had added to it that morning, and tonight, she would finish it. She would write everything. And if she couldn't escape, someone, someday, would find it. And they would know. She passed her younger siblings in the hallway, David, Ruth, and little Benjamin, their eyes wide, unaware of the true danger, but sensing the fear in the air. She paused. Knelt beside Benjamin. Tucked a stray curl behind his ear. Smiled, not with joy, but with resolve. Tonight, if it cost her everything, she would not let them be taken. As the pale winter sun sank toward the horizon, its last light bathed the compound in a crimson glow. The wind screamed louder now, rattling the windows like warnings from a world that could no longer intervene. And in the study, Obadiah rose from his desk, his eyes wild, his mouth curved in a blissful, terrifying smile. "It is time," he whispered. "The angel is waiting." And with that, the final hours of Hollow Creek's innocence began to die. The room was silent, but it hummed with madness. The walls weren't just lined with religious texts, they were stacked with corruption. Ancient mysticism, banned doctrines, and filthy reinterpretations of sacred law, handpicked to feed a single man's delusion that he was chosen by God to rewrite morality itself. One wall was completely taken over by hand-drawn charts, diagrams so grotesque, so explicit, they felt like weapons. They showed human figures in poses and acts that defied both decency and comprehension. Obadiah Lafferty didn't see them as wrong. He saw them as divine blueprints. At the center of it all sat his desk, a slab of wood buried in sermons, sketches, and instructions for rituals that escalated in horror with every passing week. And in that chair, hunched over with pen in hand, was Obadiah himself. His pen scratched the paper like a bone saw, his eyes wide with the ecstasy of madness. His once elegant handwriting had dissolved into manic scrawl. Each word was a dagger: purification, union, transcendence, all twisted into justifications for the unthinkable. And through it all, he muttered to himself. The angel speaks of the final purification. The barriers between flesh and spirit must be broken. The family must be reborn, as one. Each sentence dripped with venom, and every syllable carved the final strokes of a nightmare. But while Obadiah wrote his gospel of darkness, Miriam was being sent into the heart of it, ordered to prepare the temple. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it. The evil wasn't imaginary, it was baked into the walls. Thick stone pressed in around her, muffling all sound. The single heavy door behind her sealed like a vault. No windows. No light but candles. Just shadows that twisted like they were whispering secrets she didn't want to hear. In the center stood a platform, wide enough for multiple bodies. The white cloth that covered it was permanently stained with brown and red, ghosts of ceremonies that should never have existed. Cushions, blankets, they weren't for comfort. They were tools. The benches around it were arranged in a circle, like an audience for a show that no human soul should ever witness. Miriam didn't need to be told what would happen tonight. She knew. Her father had been building to this moment for years, feeding his followers lies dressed as revelations, blurring the line between scripture and sadism. And now, he believed the time had come, for total surrender, for sacred union, for the end of all boundaries. But what he didn't know was that Miriam had stopped believing a long time ago. Her hands trembled as she laid out the cloth. Her breath was shallow. But her mind was racing, calculating, memorizing, committing everything to memory. Because tonight, while Obadiah was preparing to become a god in his own eyes, she was planning to betray him. The diary under her bed was filled with secrets, evidence. Dates, names, rituals. The only hope the others had. She didn't know if she could save them all. But she had to try. Obadiah thought this night would be his triumph, the final purification, the unmaking of shame, the victory of his faith over the flesh. But Miriam saw something else. She saw a fire ready to consume them all. And she was done waiting to burn. The candles flickered violently, casting shadows that writhed across the stone walls like they were alive, like they knew what was coming. Miriam's hands trembled as she laid out the ceremonial items. Across from her, Rebecca, her stepmother, moved with equal dread, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Miriam, something isn't right about this. Your father's visions, they've become darker." There was fear in her voice, yes, but something else too. Realization. The sudden, gut-churning awareness that they'd been walking deeper into a trap for years, and now, the door had slammed shut. Miriam didn't answer right away. Her eyes swept the temple, every corner, every dark crevice. Because even whispers in Hollow Creek had a way of finding their way to Obadiah. Then she answered. "I know. But what can we do?" she whispered, her voice leaden. "He says questioning him is questioning God himself." She hated how familiar those words felt. How many times had she heard them, said them, believed them, until they had started to rot her from the inside out. Rebecca's hands shook as she placed the brass chalice on the altar. That chalice, the one used in ceremonies so vile that no one dared speak of them after. It gleamed in the candlelight like it was smiling. "I've been thinking about my sister in Salt Lake City," Rebecca said, her voice soft, desperate. "She's been writing. Asking me to visit. Maybe I could take some of the children." Her voice broke. Because they both knew the truth. "He'll never let you leave," Miriam replied. "You know what happened to Brother Thomas." The name landed like a hammer between them. Thomas Brennan. He was supposed to be safe, one of Obadiah's most loyal. Until he wasn't. Until he saw what they were becoming. 6 months ago, he'd announced he was leaving the compound with his wife and 2 daughters. Said he didn't believe in the sacred union anymore. Said he was done. 3 days later, he was found dead at the bottom of a ravine. The official report called it an accident. Snowstorm. Slipped and fell. But no one in Hollow Creek believed that. Because Ezekiel, Obadiah's right hand, had been sent to reason with him. He came back bloodied. Silent. Eyes like a man who had seen hell and left pieces of himself behind. Everyone knew what had happened. Try to escape, and you disappear. Miriam and Rebecca shuddered as the memory wrapped its icy fingers around them. And then the sound came. The distant tolling of a bell. Low. Hollow. Final. Purification hour. Obadiah's most sacred ritual. What had once been prayer and fasting had evolved into something else. Something darker. Something that took pieces of people, not just their faith, but their will. And tonight, the ceremony would go further than ever before. Miriam felt her pulse race. If they didn't act now, something irreversible would happen. Something that couldn't be hidden behind whispers or prayers or chalk-white lies in the snow. And she knew, before the sun rose, someone would die. Unless she did the unthinkable. Tonight, the ritual changes. Forever. What started as bathing, a basic, harmless act of cleanliness, had been twisted into something horrifying. The water, once warmed for comfort, now boiled with tension. The tub, built for function, now doubled as a stage for obedience. It wasn't just about cleanliness anymore. It was about control. Shame. And submission. Obadiah stood at the front of the room like a prophet in a firestorm. "The angel has revealed," he announced, "that modesty is a tool of Satan." His voice echoed off the wooden beams like thunder, but it wasn't divine. It was delirium. The kind that makes people do unthinkable things, and call them holy. "Tonight," he continued, "we cast aside all earthly shame. We stand before God as He created us, pure and unashamed." Those words. They didn't sound like scripture. They sounded like a sentence. Martha, strong, silent Martha, began to cry. Not loud. Not dramatic. But broken, shivering tears that splashed into the basin of blessed water she held in her trembling hands. The children noticed. They always noticed. They huddled together, faces pale, confused. Terror was a language they were fluent in. And now it was screaming at them. Even Ezekiel, Obadiah's golden son, the enforcer, the one who dragged Thomas Brennan into the snow 6 months ago, even he looked shaken. He took a breath. "Father," he said, barely audible. "Maybe the younger children shouldn't. They might not understand the..." Boom. Obadiah's fury struck like a thunderclap. His eyes went black with rage. "Are you questioning the word of the angel, my son?" The room went dead silent. You could hear the fire popping. The wind screaming outside. "Are you suggesting God's plan is flawed?" Ezekiel's mouth moved, but the words caught in his throat. "No, Father. I would never." But Obadiah's hand slammed through the air, silencing him with nothing but a gesture. He didn't need to yell now. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Then you will participate fully. As will every member of this family." The finality of that sentence. It was a prison cell slamming shut. "The sacred union requires complete participation," he said. "No exceptions. No half measures. And then he said it, the one sentence that turned dread into pure terror. Any attempt to exclude a member from the ceremony will bring divine punishment. And they all knew what that meant. Because in Hollow Creek, divine punishment meant death. And God's will looked a lot like Obadiah's rage. And then, he said it. Any attempt to exclude a member from the ceremony will make our earthly suffering seem like paradise. Those words. They didn't just threaten. They killed hope. Miriam saw it in real time. Ezekiel broke. The only person who might have stood up, gone to the authorities, tried to stop this. Gone. Just like that. Obadiah had snapped his spirit with a few lines of scripture and a stare that could burn through bone. The others began to disrobe. Not with joy. Not with faith. With fear. The kind that wraps around your throat like a noose. And Miriam. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, frozen, while something inside her shattered. Not her will. Not her soul. But the last lie she had ever told herself. That maybe, just maybe, things could go back to normal. They wouldn't. They never would. Because what happened next was the point of no return. The so-called purification ritual wasn't cleansing anything. It was calculated, predatory madness. Obadiah moved among them like a wolf in shepherd's robes. His touch was framed as holy. His eyes spoke otherwise. Feel the water washing away your earthly shame, he chanted. Let the sacred oils penetrate your flesh. Each word another violation. Each movement a ritualized excuse to do what no father should ever do. His hands lingered. His gaze lingered longer. And no one stopped him. They were too broken. Too trapped. Too conditioned to see escape. But Miriam, she had a secret. While the others were lost in the ritual, she slipped away. Every step a silent act of rebellion. Every heartbeat pounding like a war drum. She darted to her room. Pulled up the loose floorboard. And grabbed what might be the only weapon she had left. A diary. The pages were already filled with terror, with truth, with everything the outside world didn't see. But tonight needed a new entry. By candlelight, with her hands shaking and her heart on fire, she wrote. If something happens to me, let this record stand as testimony to the truth. My father is not a prophet. He is a monster. Each word, a scream written in ink. He has twisted the name of God to satisfy his own desires. This sacred union is nothing but abuse. She was done hoping. Now she was fighting. She paused, her pen hovering. Because outside her door, the ritual was changing. And Miriam had one chance left to make it out, or make it mean something. Miriam sat in silence. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the eye of a storm. Through the thin wooden walls of her tiny room, she heard the sounds from the main chamber shift. They were quieter now. Not calm, but drained. As if everyone inside was being hollowed out from the inside. She had minutes. Minutes before someone noticed she was missing. But that didn't stop her. She wrote faster, furiously, documenting everything. The rituals. The manipulation. The methodical descent into hell that her father had wrapped in scripture and called salvation. The children are the real victims, she scrawled. Mary hasn't spoken a full sentence in weeks. The twins wake up screaming every night. Benjamin is only 7, and he already knows things no child should even imagine. Her father called it spiritual awakening. She knew better. It's not enlightenment, she wrote. It's annihilation. She stitched the diary into the lining of her thickest coat, the one she'd need if she had any chance of surviving a 15-mile trek through snow-covered wilderness. No flashlight. No map. Just a prayer, and the truth. Because staying meant obliteration. Of her body. Of her soul. And of everything innocent left in her siblings. She made her way back to the temple. And stepped into a nightmare. The room was glowing. But not with light. With madness. Candles flickered along the edges of the stone walls, throwing warped shadows of human forms in unspeakable poses. The altar was no longer a place of worship. It was a stage. Obadiah stood in the center, arms outstretched, commanding his family like puppets. His voice was not raised, but it had the weight of something otherworldly. Tonight, he intoned. We become one flesh, in the eyes of the Lord. His tone was holy. But his message? Insane. Earthly relationships are illusions, he continued. The angel has revealed, only by destroying those illusions, can we reach celestial unity. The words were delivered like scripture. But what followed wasn't divine. It was depravity. Miriam's breath caught in her throat as she watched him orchestrate the unthinkable. Under the disguise of ritual, of sacred union, Obadiah pushed his family, his children, into acts that shattered every moral line ever drawn by God or man. The younger children were stripped of innocence before they could even understand what was happening. The women, forced into roles that broke the soul, not just the body. Miriam's hands clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms. Blood welled up, but she didn't feel it. She couldn't. All she could feel was the truth. If she stayed silent, they would all be lost. And if she tried to fight, she might die. Not a silence of peace, but of obliteration. No one spoke about what had happened in the temple. They moved like shadows, blank-eyed and mechanical, as if their bodies were present, but their souls had retreated somewhere unreachable. Obadiah called it the stillness of divine afterglow. Miriam called it what it truly was. Shock. 3 days passed. 3 days of whispered prayers and forced smiles. 3 days of pretending things hadn't changed, when in truth, nothing would ever be the same again. And then the blizzard came. Not just a storm, but an answer. It slammed into Hollow Creek like the wrath of God himself, shaking the wooden buildings, freezing the very breath of the compound. Snow piled high in hours. Visibility vanished. The outside world ceased to exist. For everyone else, it meant shelter. For Miriam, it meant freedom. She had waited for this. Planned for it. Every piece of flint, every scrap of food, every inch of fabric sewn into the lining of her coat had been prepared in secret, buried beneath the veil of obedience. Now, the veil dropped. That night, as the others huddled inside the main house, curled around fires and feigned warmth, Miriam dressed in layers, wrapped herself in every ounce of resolve she had left, and stepped into the white abyss. The wind nearly knocked her flat. The cold bit through her clothes like teeth. But she didn't stop. Not when the chapel's light vanished behind her. Not when the frozen trees loomed like ghosts in the dark. Not even when she tripped and hit the snow hard enough to crack her lip open. She pushed on. 15 miles of frozen wilderness. No trail. No guarantee she'd survive. But death in the woods was mercy compared to what waited back in Hollow Creek. Every step was agony. Every breath was pain. But in her coat, close to her heart, was the diary. The only record of what had happened inside the temple. If she died out here, someone might still find it. If she lived, she'd make sure they did. He barely slept now. When he wasn't pacing the stone floor of the chapel in manic reverence, he was scribbling in his leather-bound journal, pages upon pages of erratic scripture and divine instruction dictated by the angel only he could see. To him, the silence was not a warning. It was validation. This is the stillness of divine order, he preached to the blank-faced family. The old selves have died. The new selves await molding. No one responded. He didn't notice. Or didn't care. In his mind, obedience was proof of faith. And brokenness was a necessary phase of becoming pure. Miriam watched all of this unfold from the edges of rooms, her presence like a ghost of her own. But unlike the others, her silence was not surrender. It was strategy. She observed Obadiah's patterns, listened to his rants. She noted when he prayed, when he slept, when he left the chapel to walk alone through the compound whispering to the wind. He was unraveling, fast. Even more dangerous than before, but also vulnerable in his delusion. She knew what the next phase would be. He had hinted at it, the union is the seed. Now we must bring forth the harvest. That meant more rituals. More violations. Maybe even outsiders brought in. Recruited. Converted. Used. Time was running out. By the 5th day after the ceremony, food supplies had dwindled. The storm had cut them off from their usual foraging routes and the generator had failed again, plunging the compound into freezing darkness at night. Miriam seized her moment. She quietly approached Ezekiel as he was stacking firewood outside the main house, his eyes dull, his hands red and chapped from cold. She spoke only 2 words. "Do you remember?" He didn't respond at first. Just stared at her. Then, his lips barely moved, every second. That was all she needed to hear. That night, they met in the storeroom behind the chapel, where the shelves were mostly empty and the candlelight flickered low. Miriam unfolded a rough, hand-drawn map, routes she had memorized from her father's old books, topography records, and overheard radio transmissions. She pointed to a pass that curved around the northern ridge, then down through the old fire trail. "It'll take 2 nights. Maybe 3. We'll need food, fire, and silence. If we're caught." "We won't be," Ezekiel said, quietly. And for the first time since the ceremony, his voice carried something close to conviction. They agreed to leave in 48 hours. But neither of them knew. They weren't the only ones planning an escape. On the 3rd day, everything changed. Obadiah stood at the head of the table, his eyes glowing with a manic fire, and announced the unthinkable. "The angel has revealed to me the future of our lineage." The room froze. Plates untouched. Children silent. A breathless pause hung in the air like a noose. "We must cleanse the bloodline," he continued, voice rising with unholy conviction. "Only the strongest shall multiply. The weak will be culled. The pure must continue." He wasn't talking about beliefs. He was talking about people. His people. His family. He swept his gaze across the room, not like a father, but like a farmer eyeing livestock. His stare lingered far too long on his daughters. And suddenly, everyone knew. Miriam felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Rebecca went rigid, her fork clattering to the table. Mary whimpered and clung to their mother's arm. Even the twins stopped chewing. The air became heavy. Suffocating. Rebecca broke the silence, though her voice cracked with dread. "What does that mean, Father?" But deep down, she already knew. They all did. Obadiah smiled, a quiet, chilling smile. "Traditional marriage bonds are earthly illusions," he said flatly. "The angel has made it clear. I must personally ensure the purity of our bloodline." He said it so casually, so plainly, that it didn't register right away. But when it did, when the words landed, the room imploded in silent horror. Martha closed her eyes. Mary buried her face in her hands. The twins looked at each other, pale with fear. Little Benjamin started crying without even knowing why. And Miriam. She felt something rise in her throat. Something dark. Bitter. Rage. Revulsion. Survival. This wasn't just madness. This was a plan. Her father intended to use his own daughters to carry out some twisted, divine breeding ritual. He had replaced morality with doctrine, replaced love with control, and called it salvation. And unless someone stopped him, it would begin tonight. Miriam's thoughts raced. There would be no second warning. No more time. Once rhetoric turned into reality, there would be no return. She had sewn the diary into her coat. She had stashed what food she could. She had studied the terrain. The blizzard would give her cover, but it would also kill her if she miscalculated. It was now or never. If she stayed, she'd be sacrificed to a lie. If she fled, she'd face a frozen wilderness, a manhunt, and the wrath of a father who believed he spoke for God. But death in the snow was better than life as a vessel for his holy seed. The storm outside was growing louder, like the world itself screaming run. And tonight, she would. Or die trying. The storm had teeth. All day long, the wind roared like a beast prowling the edges of Hollow Creek, shredding trees and burying the world in a wall of white. But inside the temple, Miriam kept her face calm, her hands steady, even as her heart beat like a war drum. She knew this wasn't just another storm. It was her last chance. While others huddled by the fire, Miriam moved with quiet precision. Every chore was a cover, every moment a countdown. In the barn, beneath a loose plank behind the old feed barrels, she'd hidden the tools of her escape, weeks of planning reduced to a single, desperate gamble. Dried food sealed tight in cloth. Layered clothing for brutal wind. A knife. Small, sharp, deadly, for protection or the unthinkable. And most important of all, knowledge. She had mapped the forgotten mining trail in her mind like scripture. 15 miles of frozen death winding through jagged peaks, carved decades ago by men who died chasing silver. It was steep. Exposed. Easy to lose. Easy to vanish forever. But it led to the outside world. To help. To safety. To a future. That evening, as Obadiah gathered the family for what he called devotion, Miriam sat among them, still as stone, hiding the fire burning behind her eyes. Obadiah's voice boomed with manic energy, his eyes bloodshot with obsession. He was unraveling, drunk on his own prophecy, trembling like a man possessed. Tomorrow night, he declared, we begin the cleansing of bloodlines. Silence. Miriam felt the floor tilt beneath her. The angel has spoken, he continued. Mary and Miriam have been chosen. They are ready to receive the pure seed. The sacred vessels of God's new generation. Time stopped. Mary whimpered, a sound so small, so fragile, it barely broke the tension in the room. She pressed herself against their mother, but Martha had long since vanished inside her own mind, curled like a ghost with eyes that saw nothing. The twins turned white. No words. Just terror. Even Benjamin began to cry. He didn't understand why, but he felt it. Miriam couldn't breathe. Her father's words weren't threats anymore. They were blueprints. The ritual wasn't just a prophecy, it had a date, a time, a target. Tomorrow. She hadn't planned to leave tonight. She'd wanted more time. But there was no more time. If she waited, she wouldn't just lose her chance to escape. She'd lose everything. The clock was ticking. The storm was rising. And Miriam Lafferty was about to run for her life. Tonight was it. The last night Miriam Lafferty would ever sleep under her father's roof, or die trying to escape it. Because tomorrow, Obadiah wasn't just planning another ritual. He was planning her violation. Hers and Mary's. And Miriam would rather vanish into a blizzard and never be seen again than become part of his twisted vision of purity. I'm feeling unwell, she said aloud, steadying her voice, pressing a trembling hand to her forehead. A lie, but it slid off her tongue like a prayer she'd practiced for years. A lie to buy time. A lie to save her life. Obadiah's eyes narrowed. The air went cold. He studied her like a predator studies prey that suddenly moved. For a terrifying moment, she thought he saw through everything, the fear in her voice, the plan behind her eyes. That he'd drag her back to the altar himself. But then Rebecca spoke. She's been pale all day, husband, she said gently. Too gently. Too calm. But he bought it. She should rest, for tomorrow. The word tomorrow hung in the air like a blade. Obadiah nodded. Just once. Miriam didn't wait. She slipped into her room like a shadow and became still as death. 2 hours. She lay perfectly quiet, muscles tense, ears sharp. Listening to the walls breathe, the fire crackle, the footsteps fade. Waiting for sleep to settle over Hollow Creek like snow on a corpse. The wind outside screamed. A wall of white noise, masking everything. It would cover her footsteps. It would hide her scent. It would bury her trail. And maybe bury her too. But she didn't care. She moved fast. She grabbed the hidden supplies, dried food, stitched clothing, a knife small enough to tuck in her boot. She layered everything she owned onto her body until she looked like a quilt come to life. The diary, the one that held everything, every crime, every ritual, every name, was sewn into her coat, pressed to her heart like a secret bomb waiting to detonate. She'd even stolen cash. Enough to get her to Salt Lake City, if she could make it out of the mountains alive. She crept into the night. And the night roared back. The wind hit her like a fist. Snow clawed at her legs, dragging her down with every step. Visibility was gone, her world reduced to white, ice, and the bone-deep cold of fear. Each step toward the barn felt like walking through quicksand made of ice and shadows. The snow climbed to her knees. Her breath turned to knives in her throat. But she kept going. Because behind her, Obadiah waited with divine purpose and dead eyes. And ahead of her, somewhere beyond the storm, was freedom. Or death. But at least it would be her choice. She wasn't just running for herself. She was running for Mary. For the twins. For everyone still trapped in the nightmare she was leaving behind. The second Miriam stepped into the barn, the cold slammed into her like a wave. She moved fast, grabbed the last of her hidden supplies, and turned to face the horses. Noble, powerful creatures, prisoners just like her. She laid a trembling hand on the neck of the gray mare and whispered a silent goodbye. She wanted to take one, but she couldn't. In this storm, they'd die. And their absence would blow her cover before sunrise. She was on her own. And the first mile? It was hell. The wind shredded through her like razor wire. The snow clawed at her legs, trying to drag her down, pull her back to the cult, to Obadiah. Every step was a fight. Every breath felt like fire. But with every brutal yard she crawled away from that compound, something stirred in her chest. Hope. It had been so long she almost didn't recognize it. Somewhere out there, past the ice and the darkness, was freedom, and maybe even justice. The trail was gone, buried. Nothing but faint shapes in the snow. But Miriam had memorized this terrain like her life depended on it. Because it did. She moved by instinct. Guided by ridgelines and muscle memory, by desperation and rage and love for the siblings she was leaving behind. She slipped. Hard. The snow swallowed her. Her coat soaked instantly. Ice stabbed into her bones. One fall could kill her. But she got up. Then she fell again. And got up again. Because quitting meant Obadiah won. And she wouldn't give him that. Mary was alone now. Her little sister. Just 15. And tomorrow, she would face the ceremony, alone. The thought nearly broke Miriam in half. But she couldn't go back. Saving them meant finishing this. Escape first. Help later. That was the only path forward. Staying would have added one more victim. Leaving might be their only chance. Hours passed. Her limbs were failing. Her vision blurred. She started hallucinating voices in the wind. But then. There. A faint flicker. Tiny pinpricks of golden light. The settlement. She pushed forward. Barely able to move. Every inch a war. Until. She collapsed on the edge of the trail. Frozen. Exhausted. Barely breathing. But. She had made it. Alive. Free. And carrying the evidence that could bring it all crashing down. She had made it out alive. But now came the part even more dangerous than the escape. Unleashing the truth. Behind her, the Lafferty compound still stood, cold, buried in snow, and dripping with secrets. A fortress of silence. A prison of lies. But sewn into Miriam's coat was a weapon more powerful than bullets. The truth. A diary filled with names, dates, orders, and horrors. And now, it was in the hands of a girl who refused to stay silent. Enter, Sheriff William Morrison. 15 years of chasing outlaws, breaking up bar fights, and cleaning up bloodstains from land disputes gone wrong. But nothing prepared him for what he saw when his office door creaked open that morning. A figure in the snow. Skin blue. Lips cracked. Stumbling, gasping, and then collapsing face first onto the floor. It was Miriam. And she looked like she'd just escaped the very mouth of hell. Sheriff Morrison didn't hesitate. Dr. Hayes, he barked. Now. Dr. Samuel Hayes was a relic of Eastern medicine trapped in the frontier West, thin, pale, tubercular, but brilliant. Compassionate. One of the only men within 200 miles who knew how to handle a case like this. He worked nonstop for 3 hours, trying to save Miriam's limbs from the creeping black of frostbite. No one spoke. Just the sound of steam, fire, and whispered prayers. Finally, her eyes opened. She blinked. And then she spoke. Not about the pain. Not about the cold. Not even about her own suffering. "There's a diary," she rasped. "In my coat. Inside it, pages soaked in ink and truth. Names. Rituals. Plans for a cleansing of bloodlines. Evidence that could tear apart the cult. Evidence that could bring down Obadiah Lafferty." Sheriff Morrison read just 3 pages and dropped into a chair like he'd been punched. "If even half of this is true," he whispered, eyes wide, "we're looking at something this town's never seen before." And they hadn't. Because what was coming next would shake all of Utah. She had nearly frozen to death to get there. Miriam Lafferty staggered into the sheriff's office just after dawn, her face frostbitten, her coat soaked through, her lips cracked and barely able to form words. But what she said shattered everything. "Please, you have to read it. You have to know what he's done." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it hit like a gunshot. In that moment, Sheriff William Morrison knew this wasn't some lost traveler or runaway child. This was something darker. Something wrong. Morrison had heard the rumors. Everyone had. Strange rituals up in the Hollow Creek compound. A self-declared prophet. Families cut off from the world. But out here in frontier Utah, strange didn't always mean dangerous. Not until today. Miriam reached into the lining of her coat with trembling hands and pulled out a small, battered, leather-bound book. It looked ordinary. But the moment Morrison touched it, everything changed. Each page felt like it weighed 10 pounds. It wasn't just a diary, it was a record. A timeline of evil. Dates. Names. Details. All written in the clear, steady hand of a 17-year-old girl who had grown up too fast, seen too much, and risked everything to make it stop. The first entry made his stomach turn. "Father announced today that the angel has revealed new truths about family bonds. He says earthly laws are tools of Satan." Morrison read on, his hands shaking now, not from cold, but rage. "Martha wept during devotions. He says resistance is demonic." Mary pleaded, but he forced her. The twins were made to watch. Each line sank deeper like a blade. Miriam had documented the rituals, the control, the abuse, night after night, for years. And no one outside the compound had known. Until now. She hadn't just escaped. She had built a case. Her body was failing. Her skin showed the early black signs of frostbite. But somehow, she had preserved the most damning evidence imaginable. She hadn't run away to save herself, she had done it to expose everything. And now the burden of justice shifted. Morrison closed the book. His heart thundered. His mind raced. All those years of whispers, he had ignored them. Dismissed them. But this girl had walked through a blizzard to deliver the truth, and the truth was sickening. There was no more doubt. There was only one choice. At sunrise, he would ride. And what waited behind the snow-covered walls of the Lafferty compound would test the limits of justice, faith, and what one girl's courage could truly destroy. Dr. Hayes didn't say a word, he just turned and walked out into the snow. Moments later, the sounds of retching echoed through the alley. He'd treated bullet wounds, childbirth infections, even a typhoid outbreak. But this broke something inside him. Inside the office, the air was thick with shock. Sheriff Morrison kept reading. He had to. Every page was worse than the last, but he forced himself through it with the grim resolve of a man staring down the devil. The words weren't just disturbing, they were surgical. Cold. Controlled. Miriam had documented everything with the precision of a trained investigator, not a terrified girl living in captivity. Father says purity must be protected through blood. The angel told him it's time. Tomorrow, he begins the cleansing. Morrison froze. That wasn't just abuse. That was a timeline. A countdown to something unthinkable. He looked at Miriam, who lay wrapped in wool blankets, her skin raw, her eyes hollow from trauma and cold. She didn't flinch. She just watched, waiting to see if he truly understood. He did. And it terrified him. Morrison was a father. 2 daughters. Same age as the Lafferty girls. And as he read the final entry, rage and helplessness collided inside him like thunder. He says he must begin breeding his daughters to preserve our spiritual bloodline. I cannot let this happen. I'd rather die in the snow. That was her line in the sand. And she crossed it alone. This wasn't just the journal of a victim, it was a last will, a battle cry, a blueprint for justice. Every word was a match. Every page, gasoline. And now it was in Morrison's hands. He closed the diary, slowly. His knuckles white. The storm outside hadn't stopped, but a new storm was forming inside him. One that wouldn't pass. He looked at Miriam. Her voice was calm now. Steady. 3 years. That's how long it's been. At first, it was just strange prayers. Then came the rituals. Then, the sacrifices. He said each message from the angel demanded more. Morrison stood. He paced. He planned. The line between lawman and father blurred with every step. Because this wasn't just about one girl anymore. It was about saving the others before it was too late. The compound was miles away. He didn't care. He would ride. He would storm the gates of hell itself if he had to. Because now the clock was ticking. And the devil had a name. Brenda Lafferty. He had built a kingdom of nightmares. But Miriam. She'd just lit the fuse. This wasn't a normal case. Not even close. This is a rescue mission, Sheriff Morrison said, fire building in his voice. We move now or those kids die in that compound. But Miriam shook her head. Her voice, low, haunted, cut through the urgency like a blade. You don't understand. They won't let you. Father's followers will die before they let outsiders in. And then, worse. The children, they've been trained to believe that pain is proof of faith. They think resisting rescue is godly. The room fell silent. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a siege against a cult. A compound sealed off by brainwashing, snow, and fanaticism. Morrison realized he wasn't dealing with criminals. He was facing disciples. This went beyond his badge. Beyond his jurisdiction. It was the kind of situation where one wrong move could get everyone killed, including the people they were trying to save. So he made the hardest decision of his career. We're calling in the feds. Within 48 hours, the quiet streets of Hollow Creek turned into a nerve center of coordinated action. The cavalry had arrived. Marshal James Crawford, tall and sharp-eyed with silver hair and a war veteran's grit, led a tactical response team from Salt Lake City. These were men who'd handled armed standoffs, mountain cults, and suicide pacts. But even they knew, this was different. This isn't just a raid, Crawford told Morrison. It's a chess match with lives on the line. We need precision. We need patience. Psychologists were flown in. Trauma counselors readied recovery tents. Every angle was covered, from breaking down barriers to rebuilding minds. But just as the team finalized their plan, a new nightmare arrived. A supply wagon that made routine deliveries to Hollow Creek never returned. The driver, an old trapper named Griggs, was known for his punctuality. Now. Vanished. No sign. No tracks. Just an empty trail swallowed by snow. The team gathered around a map. Had the compound cut off all contact? Had they discovered Miriam's escape? Or worse? Had they begun the cleansing? Crawford didn't hesitate. No more waiting. We move at dawn. The clock was ticking. The storm was rising. And inside those mountains, hell was preparing for war. A supply wagon just got turned away at gunpoint. Why? Because inside the Lafferty compound, a madman claimed God told him the government was coming. And he was ready to wage holy war. They are God's chosen. We are the devil's army. This just went from a rescue mission to a full-blown cult siege. Marshal Crawford stared at the map, jaw clenched. This is it. They're digging in. If we mess this up, they'll kill the kids before they surrender. Every single person in that room felt the same chill. This wasn't a police raid anymore. This was a race against mass murder. Miriam sat silently in the corner, her face pale. She had escaped and told the truth. But now, that truth might be the very reason her siblings would die. What if telling the truth kills them? She stood up slowly. There's another way in. Instant silence. A trail. Through the old mining road. It leads behind the barn. If you make a loud enough distraction up front, we might get the children out before he notices. Crawford's eyes narrowed. This was their one shot. But it would take perfect coordination, or everything would collapse. The plan. Team Alpha storms the front gate, full force, lights, sound, chaos. Team Bravo, with Miriam leading, slips in through the back trail, grabs the kids, and escapes before the compound erupts. But here's the terrifying twist. Oadia Lafferty had already proven he was willing to kill to protect his twisted kingdom. And the children. They'd been conditioned to think outsiders were demons sent to drag them to hell. They might fight against their own rescue. And then, it started snowing. Hard. Visibility dropped. Radios crackled. But there was no time to wait. The longer they delayed, the higher the risk of a cult-triggered massacre. Miriam couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, caught between hope and terror. This was the moment. She had done what she believed was right. But now, that choice might save her family, or destroy them. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the clock was ticking. Tomorrow at dawn, the mission begins. And not everyone is guaranteed to make it out. A massive snowstorm was rolling in. And it was about to cloak the biggest cult rescue mission in U.S. history. But here's the terrifying twist. That storm. It was the perfect cover for the lawmen. And the perfect chaos for something to go horribly, horribly wrong. Inside the walled-off nightmare of Hollow Creek, one man was preparing for war. This is it, Oadia whispered to his inner circle. The final test. The world will burn, and we will ascend. Back at the sheriff's office, Dr. Ace was racing against time. Not to load bullets, but to load hope. Psychological kits. Trauma support. Medical bags. Because if they got those kids out alive, their battle wouldn't end at the gates. They'd be stepping straight into the longest healing process of their lives. He called trauma surgeons. Clergy. Therapists. Their response. What you're walking into is beyond anything we've treated before. And then, the storm broke. Snow slammed the Utah mountains like a curtain of white dread. Above it all, two unstoppable forces surged toward collision. A cult that believed death was glory. And a task force fighting to save lives before sunrise turned red. February 15, 1863. Dawn. The rescue begins. Marshal Crawford's squad moved in like a ghost army, every breath visible in the icy air, every step laced with purpose. And then, a sound stopped them in their tracks. Musical notes singing. Hymns. Soft at first. Then louder. Then rising into an almost celestial harmony, except this wasn't worship. They're preparing for martyrdom, Crawford said, his voice a whisper of dread. They think dying today will send them straight to heaven. Inside the compound, Oadia Lafferty was ready. He had barricaded windows with furniture, turned houses into bunkers, and trained his followers to shoot without hesitation. The high ground was his. The element of surprise. Gone. This wasn't just a compound. It was a fortress. Armed sentries paced the perimeter like warriors on sacred land, eyes wild, fingers twitching on triggers. To them, this wasn't defense. This was prophecy. Everyone knew the moment had come. One wrong step, one loud breath, and it would all erupt into a bloodbath. Would the rescue succeed, or would Hollow Creek become a massacre? Next, the breach. The screams. And the ultimate twist no one saw coming. The compound was a trap. 3 buildings, reinforced like bunkers. Interlocking fields of fire. Anyone approaching from the front. Instant target. Obadiah Lafferty had been waiting for this day like it was divine prophecy. Weeks of hoarding ammo. Preaching death like it was salvation. If we fall today, he said to his followers, we rise in glory. But inside the main house, one man was cracking. Ezekiel Lafferty, the prophet's own son, standing at the window with a rifle in his hands and hell in his heart. His hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the war raging in his soul. His whole life, he'd believed his father was a chosen vessel. Now, that belief was bleeding to death inside him. And then, the silence shattered. "This is Marshall Crawford of the United States Federal Court. We have a warrant for the arrest of Obadiah Lafferty. Send out the children and women, or face the consequences." The compound went still. No return fire. No reply from the prophet. Instead, Ezekiel stepped forward. And what came next wasn't obedience. It was betrayal disguised as faith. "My father is a prophet of God. You have no authority here. Leave this place or face divine judgment." His voice cracked. Not just from fear, but because he didn't believe a word. Inside the compound, chaos had detonated. Martha Lafferty, Obadiah's wife, had snapped. Completely lost in visions of angels, demons, fire, and light. She mumbled to no one. Stared into corners like she saw the gates of heaven and hell. And her children. They were the collateral damage of years of spiritual warfare. Huddled in corners. Terrified. Pale. Listening to the sound of rifles loading and a father praying for blood. This was it. The moment when belief and reality would finally collide. Where the cost of faith would be counted in lives. Next, the trigger is pulled. And what happens next will change Hollow Creek forever. The clock was ticking. Inside the barricaded compound, fear spread like wildfire. Children shook in corners. Women stared blankly. And the sounds outside, footsteps, voices, distant commands, were confirmation of their worst fears. The angel warned me of this moment. Obadiah thundered, eyes wild with fanatic fire. The forces of Satan are upon us. Just like Pharaoh's army at the Red Sea. This wasn't just a siege. It was an apocalypse, scripted in his mind. He didn't see lawmen trying to save children. He saw demons. He saw a final test of blood and sacrifice. And his followers? They listened. Obedient. Hollow-eyed. Lost. Because to admit the truth now, that they'd followed a lie, was worse than death. But then, in the shadows of this cult-driven nightmare, one woman cracked the spell. Rebecca. The second wife. She looked at 12-year-old Samuel, curled in a corner, shaking and sobbing. And something inside her broke. "This has to stop," she whispered. "We've been so afraid of damnation that we've created hell." Beside her, Sarah, the youngest wife, blinked through fear. She saw it too. The trauma. The terror. The truth. "What can we do?" Sarah asked, voice trembling. "If we try to leave, he'll kill us. They'll all help him do it." But Rebecca didn't blink. She looked around the room. At the children. At the madness. At the prison she once called faith. And then, "They're going to die anyway if we stay. We either try, or we lose everything." This was it. The beginning of a rebellion inside the cult. 2 women. Dozens of terrified children. And a man who believed murder was holy. Next, the secret plan. The hidden passage. And a shocking betrayal from inside the compound that would turn everything upside down. The escape attempt starts now. The standoff was dragging into its second hour. And outside the compound, the tension was rising fast. We've counted 15 inside. 7 of them are kids. If we wait much longer, he'll do something we can't undo. Marshall Crawford could feel it, time was running out. Inside, fanaticism was boiling over. Outside, every second felt like borrowed time. "Sheriff Morrison," Crawford barked, "that mining trail Miriam mentioned, is it real?" Morrison's face said it all. Scarred. Cold. Determined. "It's there. It's steep. It's icy. But it's our best shot. Then move. Take 3 men. Quiet. Fast. Bring those kids home. Snowflake meanwhile, inside the house of horrors. Obadiah Lafferty had gathered his flock. And what he said next would shake the walls. The angel has spoken, he roared. Our time is now. If we can't live as God's chosen, we will die as martyrs. We will ascend in flames, proven by our blood. The crowd was silent. Even the children could feel the horror of what he meant. Even if they didn't understand the words, they felt the doom. But then. A voice. A break. A spark. No. Rebecca. One word, but it hit like a gunshot in the silence. I won't let you hurt these children anymore. Years of fear, guilt, and silence cracked all at once. No more prayers for blood. No more sacrifices for your delusions. And just like that, the clock started ticking even faster. Would the team reach the barn in time? Would Rebecca survive her defiance? Would the children make it out alive, or would Obadiah light the match? Eyes next. The rescue team reaches the compound. Guns. Snow. Screams. And a decision from Ezekiel that will either save lives or destroy everything. The temperature in the room dropped like a stone as Obadiah turned, his eyes filled with cold fury. His gaze locked onto Rebecca, and for a heartbeat, everything stood still. You dare question the will of God, he growled, each word laced with venom. You dare interfere with divine judgment. Everyone took a step back. That voice, the one that always came before pain, sent a wave of dread through the room. But Rebecca didn't move. You're not God, she said. The words cracked like lightning. You're a sick, twisted man who hides behind religion to justify your perversions. These children deserve better than to die for your madness. The dam broke. Months, years, of fear, shame, and buried fury poured out in a single breath. Obadiah exploded. His hand struck her with such force that her body hit the floor hard, blood already streaking her chin. The sound of the impact rang through the compound like a gunshot. But she got up. Her lip was split. Her face was bruised. But her eyes were on fire. Kill her, Obadiah spat, turning to Ezekiel, who stood frozen with a rifle in his trembling hands. She is possessed. Cleanse her before her corruption spreads. The boy's fingers twitched on the trigger. He looked at his father, then at Rebecca's bleeding face. Something cracked inside him, louder than the blow, louder than the order. For the first time, he saw Obadiah clearly. Not as a prophet. Not as a father. But as a man, deluded, dangerous, and lost. I can't, Ezekiel whispered. She's trying to protect the children. That's not demonic. That's human. Obadiah roared. He lunged for the weapon. Father and son collided, the rifle between them, their struggle violent and breathless, filled with years of buried control, doubt, and fear finally boiling to the surface. The chaos was deafening, but it was the opening they needed. Outside, Sheriff Morrison and his team reached the rear of the compound, just as the house erupted in shouting and thuds. Inside, Rebecca gathered the younger children, her hands shaking, her voice low but urgent. Quickly, she whispered. To the barn. Don't look back. No matter what you hear. The children moved like shadows, terrified and silent, their small feet padding across the cold floor. The house behind them trembled with violence. But they didn't look back. Outside, Morrison spotted movement. The barn door creaked. A shape emerged. Time was running out. Obadiah was still fighting inside. Ezekiel was still torn. But Rebecca had made her choice. She was getting those children out, even if it cost her everything. The wind howled. Snow whipped through the night. And out of the chaos, they ran. Women and children. Blood on their clothes. Fear in their eyes. Running for their lives. Sheriff Morrison pointed. There. Moving through the snow. Behind them. Screams. Shouts. A single gunshot, and then. Silence. What just happened? One officer whispered. Did someone just die? But there was no time to think. The kids were out. Rebecca and Sarah were leading them, barely able to stand, but refusing to fall. Blood poured down Rebecca's face. The kids stumbled, crying, gasping. But they were alive. Morrison's team sprinted toward the barn, weapons drawn, ready to provide cover. The snow was thick, visibility low, but the stakes had never been higher. This was no longer a siege. It was a rescue mission against the clock. The children crashed into the arms of federal agents. Their terror said everything. They'd just escaped hell. How many more? Morrison barked, adrenaline pumping. Rebecca's voice cracked. Martha's still in the house. But she's gone. And Ezekiel, he's hurt. There was so much blood. She couldn't even finish the sentence. And then a shadow moved. A figure stepped into the doorway of the main house. It was him. Obadiah Lafferty. His face was smeared with blood. His eyes unhinged. And in his hand a torch. The fire crackled, throwing demonic shadows across his face. It didn't even look like a man anymore. It looked like the monster they'd feared all along. And then he screamed. If I cannot have my kingdom on earth. His voice thundered over the storm. Then I shall claim my place in heaven, through fire and blood. It was happening. He was going to burn it all. The temple. The house. Everyone inside. Crawford's face turned white. Move. 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 This wasn't a siege anymore. It was a firebomb waiting to go off. Obadiah retreated into the temple, the place he once called holy, now holding the flame that would become his final judgment. Inside that structure, his final act was already beginning. And unless someone stopped him, Hollow Creek would burn. This was it. The final showdown. One madman. One match. And a dozen lives hanging in the balance. Fire the temple was burning. And U.S. Marshal Crawford. He was about to do the unthinkable. Flames exploded from the windows like the compound itself was screaming. Smoke curled through the cracks. The heat was intense, even from a distance. And Crawford realized it immediately. Obadiah wasn't just trying to die. He was trying to erase everything. Everything he built. Everything he broke. Every single crime. Inside that inferno. Evidence of years of abuse. Torture. Rituals. All of it, about to be turned to ash. Fire. This was not just fire. This was destruction by design. And the worst part? People were still in there. Martha's still inside. Rebecca screamed, tears freezing to her face in the snow. And Ezekiel. I don't know if he's alive or dead. Her voice cracked with agony. Blood from her lip had turned to ice. Crawford had 1 second. One choice. Stay safe, or go into the fire. His decision. I'm going in. Collision. He ran. Through snow. Through rising heat. Toward a structure that was already collapsing in on itself. The compound was falling apart fast. Fire licking across the roof. Exploding out of the temple and into the house. It was becoming a firestorm. The front door. Barricaded. No time. He sprinted to the side, shattered through a window with his bare hands. Glass sliced his skin, but adrenaline made him blind to the pain. Inside. Absolute devastation. The floor was a war zone of overturned chairs and smashed furniture. Smoke choked the air. Something had gone down in here. Something brutal. And then, he saw it. Ezekiel. Lying on the floor. Blood soaked his shirt. A bullet wound in his shoulder. His skin was pale, lips turning blue from shock. But his chest was rising. He was alive. But not for long, not if Crawford didn't move now. Fire. The flames were already eating their way toward the house. The temple had become a furnace, and it was coming this way. And somewhere deeper in the house. Martha. Time was out. This was now a race to save a wounded son, and find a lost mind, before the compound collapsed in a wave of fire. And Obadiah. He was still inside, somewhere. Holding on to his kingdom. Ready to take everyone with him. Fire. This is the final 5 minutes of a nightmare that lasted 20 years. Inside the burning wreckage of Hollow Creek, Marshall Crawford had seconds to save 2 broken souls from total destruction. Behind him, flames were devouring the temple. In front of him, a dying son and a mother lost to madness. Ezekiel, barely breathing, lay in a pool of his own blood. His face pale. His body limp. But he was still alive. The rifle, the same one meant to kill Rebecca, was nearby, bent, twisted from the fight. It had been used like a club. And then there was Martha Lafferty. Huddled in the corner. Rocking back and forth. Singing hymns through smoke-filled air, her voice cracked and eerie. Her eyes. Empty. Or maybe, full of something not from this world. When Crawford shouted through the smoke. "Ma'am, we need to get you out. The building's on fire." She didn't even flinch. Instead, she smiled, and whispered. "The angels are coming. The suffering is almost over." Police car light. That line sent chills down Crawford's spine. This wasn't just fear. It was total disconnection from reality. She was gone. Mentally. Emotionally. Spiritually. Whatever had happened here, it had shattered her soul. Crawford didn't have time to reason. He made the call. He would carry them both. One on his back. One in his arms. Through fire, through smoke, through hell. But in the center of the inferno, another figure was still inside. Fire. Obadiah Lafferty. The self-proclaimed prophet. The monster behind it all. He was in the burning temple, kneeling in front of the altar where he had committed unspeakable acts. Everything was flames now. Ritual robes. Sacred texts. That cursed altar, twisted and melting in the heat. But Obadiah. He was praying. "Angel of judgment. I have served you. I followed your commandments. Grant me the martyrdom I deserve." He begged the heavens for approval. But the only answer was fire. Smoke. The sickening smell of burning flesh. And in those final moments, Obadiah finally saw the truth. There were no angels. No divine voice. Just his own madness, echoing back at him through the fire. Fire. His angel of judgment. It was never real. It was him. His own twisted desires, disguised as holy commands. And as the flames consumed his temple, the kingdom of Hollow Creek collapsed. Marshall Crawford. He was running out of time. The building was coming down. The fire was at the stairs. This was it, his final chance to escape with Ezekiel and Martha before everything turned to ash. Fire. He thought he was serving God, but in the end, all he served was madness. Obadiah Lafferty, cult leader, self-proclaimed prophet, finally saw the truth. Too late to save anyone. Too late to save himself. As the fire consumed him, and consciousness slipped away, he realized the unthinkable. He hadn't led his followers to salvation. He'd led them to ruin. He hadn't served God, he'd served his own twisted hunger. The truth died with him. Coffin. No repentance. No redemption. Just a legacy of pain. And ashes. But outside, a miracle was unfolding. Fire. The roof of the main house collapsed, sparks exploding into the frozen sky like fireworks from hell. Marshall Crawford, battered and smoke-covered, emerged from the flames carrying 2 survivors. One, a blood-soaked Ezekiel, barely clinging to life. The other, Martha, catatonic and mumbling about angels. Behind them, Hollow Creek burned like the gates of the underworld. Snow vaporized into steam. The entire valley glowed orange from the fire's fury. A circle of melted earth surrounded the ruins, a scar on the land, just like the ones on the souls who escaped. Stopwatch. The rescue team regrouped. The clock stopped. Now came the tally. White heavy check mark. 7 children rescued, ages 8 to 17. But their eyes, empty. Haunted. As if pieces of them had never made it out. Rebecca and Sarah, 2 of Obadiah's wives, were safe, but shattered. Their bodies free. Their minds still locked behind cult walls. Martha. She stared at the sky, lips moving silently, trapped in a reality no one else could see. Psychiatrists would call it dissociation. But everyone there knew, her soul had been scorched long before the fire. And Ezekiel. He survived his wounds, but not without cost. He had faced down his father. He had broken the spell. But breaking free meant breaking himself. Then came the question no one wanted to ask. What about the others? Dr. Hayes asked as he wrapped gauze around a wound. Were there more inside? Rebecca's voice was flat. Distant. 3 men. 2 women. In the smaller building. I think they chose to stay. Coffin they could have escaped. But they didn't. Not because they were trapped, but because they couldn't let go. Their loyalty to Obadiah wasn't just belief, it was identity. And when that identity burned, they burned with it. No one came out of the followers' quarters. Not a scream. Not a shout. Just silence. As the flames erased them from the earth. Fire, and just like that, Hollow Creek was gone. What remained? Scorched earth. Shattered minds. And one question left behind. How many more places like this are still hidden in the world? Where obedience is mistaken for faith. And evil hides behind the mask of prophecy. This was the end of one nightmare, but only the beginning of the reckoning. The fire devoured everything. Through the long winter night, it raged like judgment itself, consuming not just buildings, but the final, fragile traces of lives twisted beyond recognition. By dawn, the Lafferty compound was reduced to blackened skeletons of wood and warped metal. Where once stood a kingdom built on fear, now smoldered a graveyard of fanaticism. But even fire couldn't silence the truth. Hidden among the ashes, one artifact survived, Miriam's diary. A child's hand had documented what no one dared speak. Line by line, it unveiled years of coercion, rituals, torment, and control. And now, it was the only surviving evidence of one of the most horrifying criminal cases in the territory's history. With Obadiah Lafferty dead, and his most loyal followers either consumed by the flames or too broken to speak, Miriam's words became the backbone of the case, a written testament to pain and courage. Federal prosecutors pieced together a narrative from the diary, the fractured memories of survivors, and blood-soaked silence. No courtroom would ever see Obadiah face justice. But through testimony and record, they built a case to ensure no one like him could rise again under the guise of divine authority. The children, 7 of them, were scattered to safe homes far from Hollow Creek. Each placement chosen with extreme care, each guardian trained to navigate the deep, unrelenting trauma carved into young minds. No quick healing. Only a long, uncertain path forward. Dr. Hayes, the only physician with first-hand knowledge of what they'd endured, collaborated with colleagues back east. He drafted new protocols, unwritten strategies for unspeakable wounds. Wounds that spoke through silence, flinches, nightmares. Rebecca and Sarah were given new names. New identities. New homes in towns where no one whispered the word cult. Their files were sealed. Their stories erased, on paper, at least. But their eyes told another tale. One of survival. One of endless nights staring at ceilings, asking why. Martha, who had wandered through fire singing hymns to invisible angels, would never return. Her mind had burned long before the walls did. She was placed in long-term care, her soul exiled to another world, unreachable. The territory responded. Funds were set aside for survivor recovery. Quiet policies were drafted to detect isolated religious compounds before they spiraled into unchecked horror. But it was too late for Hollow Creek. Rumors spread faster than the fire ever had. Whispers in saloons. Campfire tales. The prophet who burned his kingdom. The angel who never came. What happened in that compound became a warning passed between towns like folklore, always with just enough truth to chill the blood. And Miriam. She did not speak to crowds. She did not stand before reporters. But in a safe room with a locked door and a new last name, she picked up a fresh notebook. She began to write again. Not to expose. Not to testify. But to remember. Because when a world burns to ash, someone must carry the memory. And she had already learned, memory is a weapon. What if I told you? That one girl's act of courage burned an entire cult to the ground, but also left her haunted by guilt for the rest of her life. This is Miriam's story, and it starts not with escape but with fire. Fire. After the compound was reduced to ashes, Miriam didn't celebrate. She blamed herself. Even though she'd exposed her father's horrors, even though she'd saved lives, her heart screamed one question. What if I stayed? Would they still be alive? Dr. Hayes, battle-hardened from dealing with trauma others couldn't even read about, worked with her for months. He reminded her, again and again. You were just a child. You didn't destroy anyone. You saved them. But trauma doesn't follow logic. And Miriam's dreams didn't either. Because even in California, under a new name and a new sky, the flames followed her. She'd wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, the compound burning again in her mind. But then, she'd remember the faces. Her siblings. Alive. Free. Because she spoke up. Because she did the impossible. Evergreen. Back in Utah, the ruins were slowly swallowed by the wild. Trees pushed up through blackened floorboards. Rain and snow wore down the last wooden bones of a nightmare. But nature couldn't erase what happened. Because this place had become something else. A monument. Not to faith. But to how faith can be weaponized by evil men, and how one brave voice can blow it all apart. Collision. Obadiah Lafferty had tried to build a kingdom of divine judgment. But in the end, his empire wasn't sacred. It was a crime scene. The worst rituals of the Lafferty family, finally exposed. Finally stopped. But the scars? Oh, they stayed. For the survivors, healing was never complete. They carried the pain in silence, in therapy, in nightmares. But they carried something else too. Fire. They had escaped hell. And lived. To tell the truth. And in a world where evil often hides behind closed doors and holy words, their voices became the light. A warning. A promise. And proof. That even monsters can be unmasked.